The Ho-Chunk footprint is etched deeply in the soil of the Midwest, with a homeland encompassing upward of 40,000 square miles, centered on the region we now call Wisconsin. For centuries, Ho-Chunk people have called this place home. The origins of the Ho-Chunk Treaty Trail trace their first faint roots to the appearance of Europeans in Wisconsin 390 years ago. Dakota told the story.
The first white people that came among us were French, and they only came to buy furs. Many of them are still remaining among us, and none of the chiefs recollect of the French coming to buy land. They came for no other purpose than to buy our furs. Next we had the English. They did the same. They never proposed buying our lands, or anything else but our furs. I recollect the time the English were in our country, but I do not recollect of their ever proposing to buy any of our land at all.
While the Revolutionary War gave the newly formed United States an interest in the region which would become Wisconsin, it was not until the end of the War of 1812 that the U.S. presence was felt here in substance. United States pursuits differed from those who came before. The trade in furs continued, but underlying interests in the natural resources of the Ho-Chunk homeland, in the land itself, mounted. Coinciding with this subtle shift came the first major treaty between the Ho-Chunk Nation and the federal government. A massive meeting was called at the confluence of the Wisconsin and Mississippi rivers in the summer of 1825. Representatives of over 9 major tribal groups were summoned to council for the apparent purpose of establishing peaceful relations between these tribes by delineating boundaries between them. In retrospect, this task of boundary defining concealed a deeper aim. One cannot acquire land unless one defines those who currently hold claim to it. This procedure of defining indigenous land claims would lay the groundwork for every treaty on the Ho-Chunk Treaty Trail over the next half-century, despite the fact that it conflicted sharply with the philosophy of land ownership held by those who were assembled.
The lands I claim are not only claimed by us, but by our brothers the Sac and Fox, Menominee, Iowa, and Sioux. They have used it in common. It would be difficult to divide it. It belongs as much to one as the other. My fathers, I did not know that any of my relations has any particular land. It is true everyone owns his own lodge in the ground he may cultivate. I had thought the rivers were the common property of all Indians, and not used exclusively by any particular nation.
In the years immediately preceding and following this first major treaty, dramatic changes began to rack the southern reaches of the Ho-Chunk homeland. Ho-Chunks had mined and utilized a natural mineral resource within their homeland for centuries, which they called Hitsugera. To Yankee Americans, Hitsugera was lead. Lead was cash. Lead in Ho-Chunk land was abundant. What started as a trickle became a full-on mineral rush of people from across the continent, and eventually the world, to Ho-Chunk lands.
When some lead was found and it was known down the Mississippi, white men came flocking to Fever River, like the wolves in the plains to the dead buffalo. There is not much land to hold them. They spread out in every direction and began to dig and find and carry off lead on the Ho-Chunk lands.
Tensions dramatically built in the region as Ho-Chunks were displaced and mistreated by the illegal mining operations, which were not restrained by the U.S. government. Rumors in 1827 of Ho-Chunks being killed by the U.S. military at Fort Snelling in Minnesota resulted in retaliation by a Ho-Chunk leader named Redbird, who sought his tribe's support to militarily expel the lead miners from Ho-Chunk land. The tribe as a whole held its peace, and Redbird surrendered himself. This seemed to give miners new resolve to encroach even further into Ho-Chunk territory. The U.S. government cultivated greater resolve too, arriving in 1828 to establish a permanent military garrison in the center of Ho-Chunk land. Fort Winnebago was constructed at the Fox, Wisconsin Portage under the command of Major David E. Twiggs. Just weeks before the military arrived, William Clark, the Indian superintendent at St. Louis, remarked, "The Winnebagos have manifested a degree of forbearance highly creditable to themselves. The whites have not scruples to advance into the village of those people, to dig mineral from under their feet, and to destroy the corn which is their only dependence through the winter to sustain the lives of their women and children." That same year, a second treaty entered the picture. With instructions to acquire the Ho-Chunk lead mining land, Treaty Commissioners Louis Cass and Pierre Menard convened Ho-Chunk elders at Green Bay, seeking a cession of land. Their proposal was strongly rejected by Ho-Chunk leader White Crow, who pointed out the inconsistencies exhibited by the government since the 1825 treaty. You recollect the line we drew at the Council of Prairie du Chien. Some of your young men have perhaps not seen it. They have come over it and are now upon us, and are driving us from our camps. Father, if you had a piece of land and a stranger should take possession of it, would you like it? No land cession resulted from this treaty. Only a new line which the government promised they would not allow the lead miners to cross. A delegation traveled to Washington, D.C. that winter, followed by another call for assembly at Prairie du Chien the following summer, in July 1829. Ho-Chunk voices strongly opposed the demanded cession of their mineral land for days during this treaty council. Compromises were offered by Ho-Chunk elders with moderate cessions, but the U.S. commissioners were not appeased. If you get the land to where you ask, what can you do with it? If you get all our country, where can we go? We cannot get our living like the whites. We cannot live and work as they do. We must not be too crowded. What answer do you want? What can we say more than we have? What can we say tomorrow? We don't think we can give more. If we could get our living east of the Four Lakes, we would give you the land, but we cannot. As we look upon you as our fathers, you would not wish to see us suffer. With no resolution following Crow Killer's concluding words, the negotiations ended. Days later, however, Ho-Chunk elders were gathered once more, and the first treaty of cession in Ho-Chunk history was signed. This treaty ceded all the land the U.S. government had demanded. Although the 1829 treaty ceded land, it did not yet specify the expulsion of its Ho-Chunk inhabitants. The tempo of change and upheaval accelerated. One result of this first treaty of cession was the promise of a government embassy to serve the Ho-Chunk nation at modern-day Portage. This is where our historic site, the historic Indian Agency House at Fort Winnebago, enters the story. 3 years later, war arrived. It was a conflict in which the Ho-Chunk nation remained a neutral party. The Black Hawk War of 1832 brought Sauk and Meskwaki groups resisting forced expulsion, as well as U.S. military forces, deep into Ho-Chunk land. At war's end, Ho-Chunk leadership was jolted by a newly codified U.S. policy: Indian removal west of the Mississippi River. A treaty signed September 15, 1832, required that Ho-Chunk cede their remaining land east of the Wisconsin River as a condition of peace with the federal government, on the grounds that a few of their young men had joined with Black Hawk. Further, they must vacate all previously ceded land by June 1st, 1833. On the day this treaty was signed, over half of the Ho-Chunk Nation was left homeless. In place of the ceded territory, treaty commissioners established a strip of land across the Mississippi River, opposite Prairie du Chien, as an alternative new home for Ho-Chunks. This land was called the Neutral Ground. Ho-Chunk leaders returned to their families in shock. Indian subagent Henry Gratchett wrote, "On my arrival home from Rock Island, I found that some of the leading men of the Winnebagos informed Mrs. Gratchett they were forced to make a treaty which they were much displeased with. That winter, a horrific famine ravaged the Ho-Chunk Nation, a result of wartime displacement and broken government promises of relief. If hunger was on Ho-Chunk minds that winter, so was the treaty's stipulation for their expulsion that spring. Ho-Chunk sent word to government officials at Washington through multiple channels, knowing that the timing scheduled for removal would guarantee another year of lost crops and starvation. Tell the president how we have suffered this past winter. We want him to permit us to cultivate our fields once more this summer, and it is all we ask. Tell him we speak strong, and we want him to think strong, for our poor women and children. Our wish is for peace. If the president cannot grant our request, we will then move. Our families will then have to suffer, and we will be miserable for a great while." No respite was allowed by the officials at Washington. Ho-Chunk families picked up their roots and departed from their ancestral villages. Others moved at the point of bayonet, as dragoons scoured the land for stragglers. When the dust cleared, the majority of Ho-Chunks had chosen to relocate to tribal land across the Wisconsin River, rather than to the Neutral Ground reservation across the Mississippi. This was strongly condemned by certain government officials, but the fact was acknowledged that these Ho-Chunks had availed themselves of the legitimate right to remain in their Wisconsin River territory, which the 1832 treaty could not legally contradict. But the treaty trail for the Ho-Chunk Nation was far from over. Fears that the land north of the Wisconsin River could not support so many people had been confirmed. Many slipped back across the Wisconsin River as an alternative to starvation. In 1836, just days before the Wisconsin Territory convened its first legislative council, Governor appointee Henry Dodge arrived at Portage seeking title to all remaining Ho-Chunk property in Wisconsin. Dodge requested land, but what he received from the delegated council speaker Dakota was a history lesson and a strong refusal to cede any more ancestral land. We were all born and raised on the land we now live upon. The country we now live upon was never occupied by the whites. They cannot say they have a right to it. They were obliged to cross the Great Water before they could reach our country. This is the land of our forefathers, the land where we have the first recollection of becoming a nation, and we cannot consent to leave it. We have been told that our country is not good.
What does our great father want to buy it for, if it is not good? All our principal men have died upon it, and we wish to remain here. I do not believe there is a man, white or red, who can say he owns the world. It was our great Maker that made it, and he alone is master of it. I hope the President will hear everything that has been said upon this subject, and it is the wish of our warriors, young men, and children, that he would let us remain in peace. The government would not be refused. Although Dodge had eloquently expressed before the treaty that, quote, "It is the wish of your great father when treaties are made with his red children, that as many of them should be collected together as possible, in order that everything should be distinctly understood by the whole nation," end quote. This concept had little bearing in the next land cession attempt, which would come 1 year later, in 1837. That autumn, Ho-Chunks warily sent a small delegation of men to Washington, D.C., under the assurances that they would not be asked to make a treaty. However, as soon as they arrived in Washington, a treaty was drawn up and signed under threats, great duress, and protests of the Ho-Chunk delegates that they had no legal authority to sell. It is perhaps no simple oversight that no known transcript was kept of the treaty negotiations. This document ceded all remaining Ho-Chunk land in Wisconsin, and now required that all Ho-Chunks relocate themselves to the neutral ground. It further reduced the area of the neutral ground in which they could live by 20 miles, and nullified previous promises relating to payments and services guaranteed in earlier treaties. What's more, the Ho-Chunk delegates were stunned to hear upon returning to Wisconsin that they had only months to leave the territory. They had been told in Washington that they would have 4 years. Our father told us at Washington that we were to remain 4 years on the land. We came back under this belief. We now ask of you to permit us to remain on this land 4 years. It is hard for us to leave, but much harder for our brothers from the Portage. Father, we ask this of you, for the words we have heard today are not what we heard at Washington. Fathers, many of the chiefs went to Washington before me, and the promises they made to us have not yet been fulfilled. After I returned from Washington, I told the other chiefs what had been done. Father, you must not think me angry because I speak loud. In the end, year by year reprieves were reluctantly allowed. In 1839, only one more winter was permitted. The final expulsion would come in the spring. The President has given permission to remain at Fort Winnebago for 1 winter longer. We like the country we sold him, and our women and children do nothing but cry when we told that they must leave it forever next spring. The years 1840 and 1841 brought U.S. military units, which announced each year that they had substantially scraped all Ho-Chunk communities from Wisconsin's map. But each year they were proven wrong. What these military leaders were witnessing was Ho-Chunk families putting into practice ideas which had been formed over the previous decade. Ideas on how to live in an era of expulsion. For some, the choice was to face the future by subsisting as fugitives in their own homeland, willing to endure multiple removals, reprisals by settlers, and whatever other hardships this course would produce over time. The survival strategy for others was to follow where the treaty trail demanded, in this instance conceding to give the neutral ground a try. Determining how to best navigate this time of devastation and suffering was not easy. The treaty trail had come to a geographic fork. Each family had to decide what was best for them. Those who chose Wisconsin and those who chose compliance
equally sought the safest route for their families to navigate through the trauma. For thousands, the path now led to the neutral ground, which for a decade already had been touted as an alternative home across the Mississippi for Ho-Chunk families. Join us for the continuing story in Episode 3.